Hi everyone, Ellie here, and welcome to part 2 of my build log for Raphtalia from the Rising of Shield Hero. Last time we worked on Raphtalia's red and brown overdress, and today we're going to go ahead and tackle her bust armor. So let's get started! Before beginning work on this project, I went through and made a pattern using paper on my dress form. I simply pinned this around my dress form where I wanted the pattern to lay, and then cut this out and tested it a few times to make sure it was exactly what I wanted. After I had my pattern ready, I went ahead and cut it out of my pleather material as well as a layer of craft foam. Once my materials were all cut out, I went ahead and stitched together the pleather layers using some basic brown thread and a very simple straight stitch. This did get somewhat complicated in the front where Raphtalia has this very interesting and sharp design. However, I found that doing little sections at a time made this a lot easier. Once I had my armor stitched together, I went ahead and held it up to my dress form to make sure it was still fitting the way I wanted it to. And luckily, it did, and it looked really awesome. Now we get to begin the longest and most frustrating part of this project. We are going to be using contact cement to glue our craft foam onto our pleather. I decided to do it this way so that way our pleather would have a little bit more body like real armor or real leather, but it wouldn't be as hard as something like Warbler or Wonderflex. This also gives me the ability to stitch together our pieces and to do some top stitching afterwards. So after a little bit of trial and error, I found that the best way to get your craft foam to stick to your pleather is to do 2 layers of contact cement on both of your pieces. So for each piece, I would first put contact cement onto the pleather, then onto the craft foam, then again on the pleather and again on the craft foam, then I could stick them together. You might also notice that I am wearing a glove while I'm doing this. Contact cement, while it isn't terrible for you, is still something that you should use with caution. So this means that you should use this in a room that is properly ventilated and try your best not to get it all over your skin. Once I had finished contact cementing all of my craft foam onto my pleather armor, it was time to add these details. Raphtalia has some beautiful details on her armor, and I decided I'm going to be adding these and making them 3D with craft foam covered in pleather, just like the rest of our armor. So I started by simply tracing the top of my breast armor to make sure I had a coherent shape, and then I was able to sketch on the designs that I liked. Once I had these sketched onto my craft foam, I went ahead and cut them out of my craft foam and then cut a much larger piece, but of a similar shape, out of my pleather. Now I was going to go ahead and use my glue gun, and I'm going to hot glue the edges of the pleather over. You might notice on the top piece I only glued over the underside of this craft foam. This way the top piece can be put into the hem of the armor. Once I had finished hot gluing these pieces, it was time to attach them to my armor. I didn't want to attach them using hot glue since if you bend hot glue, it can sometimes crack or break. I attached them using E6000, which is one of my favorite glues, but again, it's somewhat toxic, so be sure to use it in a well-ventilated environment. I do want to note though that after I used the E6000 to attach these pieces, I realized that it wasn't exactly holding up the way I wanted it to. So I went through and hand-stitched each of these pieces onto my armor. That's one of the pros of using fabric for your armor. You can hand-stitch if you need to. With the rest of my armor finished, it's time to go ahead and cut out my lining. I'm using a very simple black cotton. This is something I had left over from my punk rock Hanamaru, and I'm going to be cutting this out using the same pattern as I did for my craft foam and my pleather. Once this is cut out, I'm going to go ahead and stitch it all together. Now that both the fashion layer and the lining layer of my armor are ready, it's time to stitch them together. I'm going to very carefully line up these 2 pieces to make sure all of my seams match, and then I'm going to pin all the way around the top edge of this armor. Once it's pinned into place, I'm going to go ahead and stitch it together. It was somewhat a pain to stitch this together since the pleather has been covered in E6000 and you might be stitching through craft foam every once in a while, but in the end it gives you a really, really nice look. I will also note that turning the straps inside out was extremely challenging. It took me a lot of time to turn those inside out, but again, in the end, I think it's totally worth it. Now that I turned everything inside out, it's actually starting to look like armor, and I love the way it looks. Next, we're gonna move on to some top stitching. Before top stitching, I went through and pressed my armor, making sure that everything was as flat as possible. After that, I went through and top stitched all the way around the straps. Now I'm going to be finishing off this bottom edge by folding over the pleather and catching our cotton lining in it. This way, everything is finished nicely and we have no raw edges. Pleather does not fray in any sort of way, so this is a perfectly fine way to finish off this armor. Once everything was pinned into place, I went ahead and top stitched this right next to the edge of my pleather line at the bottom of my armor. Again, I will note that stitching this was extremely difficult. This is somewhere where it is absolutely necessary to be wearing safety glasses because your needle could break at any moment and you don't want that to go flying into your eyes. So be sure to wear protective gear when you're working with challenging materials such as pleather and craft foam. Now it's time to go ahead and attach our straps. I'm going to pin these into place and then hand stitch them onto my armor. After that, it's time to add our closures. I decided to use a couple hook and bars as closures for this armor. So I simply pinned these into place on the side of my armor and hand stitched them on. Once our armor was fully created, it's time to add a little bit of detail. I love the way the pleather armor looks, however, it can be a little bit flat. So I'm going to be adding some shading using my acrylic paints and a little bit of water. I went ahead and added shading everywhere where there's a seam line. If you were wearing real leather armor, you would get tons of dirt in those seams, so it's only realistic to have them be a little bit darker than the rest of the armor. I also went through and added some highlight as well, just for a little bit more detail. You might think that this shading and highlight looks a little bit intense. However, I think that's mostly just the lighting in my room bumping up the colors. In real life, this looks really, really great and super realistic. Now I've let our armor dry for a few days and it's time to add the little lace-up detail that Raphtalia has on the back of her armor. I did this in the same way that I did the lace-up detail on her main dress. These are little scraps of pleather that I've folded over and top stitched, and now I'm going to be pinning them into a crisscross pattern on the back of my armor, and then following my top stitch from before to stitch them into place. And with those stitched on, our armor is now finished. I really love the way that this came out. I think the craft foam gives it a nice sturdiness without making it too bulky, and it still looks like real leather armor. I also love that we added the shading. I think it adds an extra detail and really brings this costume to life. I'm so happy with the way Raphtalia is looking, and I can't wait to move on to the next piece of her costume. Next time, we are going to be working on Raphtalia's white underdress, so make sure you subscribe so you'll know when that video comes out. And until next time, keep sewing, stay positive, and have fun. I'll see y'all later. Bye!